A compelling and shocking video that's stirring controversy from Iraq to the United States. A damaging documentation of death on the streets of Baghdad. What are the rules of engagement? Who gets to decide who lives and who dies? What happened to winning hearts and minds? Or is it just the reality of war? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Nick Clark. Welcome to the show. The White House on Tuesday described leaked and graphic video of a US helicopter strike in Baghdad which killed 2 Reuters employees as tragic. But spokesman Robert Gibbs insisted that US forces in war zones take great pains to avoid civilian casualties. Mohammed Shakir has more on the story.
Light them all up. Come on, fire!
The truth of what happened that day in July 2007 may have never come to light had it not been for WikiLeaks. On several occasions, the Apache gunners appeared to fire rounds into people after they had died or suffering from debilitating wounds. That seems a serious breach of the rules of engagement and the law of armed combat.
Hotel 26,
The WikiLeaks website said it received these footage taken from a US helicopter camera from a military whistleblower. It shows what happened to 2 Reuters journalists as they tried to cover the fighting on the Baghdad streets. WikiLeaks has identified the journalists and provided the subtitles. The military says the provocation came when they saw this. It was in fact a camera, and the military investigation that followed said that this was the picture he was taking. According to the investigation, the furtive nature of the cameraman's movement gave every appearance of preparing to fire an RPG on US soldiers. In this vehicle was a father and his 2 children, who stopped to help a wounded man on the street.
We were coming back and we saw an injured man. My father said, let's take him to the hospital. Then I heard only the bullets. Why did they shoot us? Didn't they say we were only children?
A short time later, US soldiers can be seen carrying injured children. Their families say they were handed over to an Iraqi hospital a day later.
The Americans wanted to kill us. Me, my brother, and my father.
The children survived, but their bodies were badly scarred. Their father wasn't so lucky, and now their uncle wants the pilots tried.
I demand that the pilot be taken to the courts. Nobody gave the children anything. Their rights are gone, and the Americans didn't even compensate for the destroyed car. I sold it for $500 to spend the money treating them.
The Pentagon says the recording is authentic, and the pilots were justified in opening fire. For the families of the 2 killed journalists and the driver, no investigation will bring back their loved ones. On the contrary, the increasing anger, frustration, and sense of injustice will make it almost impossible to win Iraqis' hearts and minds. Mohammed Shakir for Inside Story.
Well, joining us now to discuss this issue are our guests, Glenn Greenwald, who joins us via broadband from Rio de Janeiro. He's a former constitutional lawyer and a columnist for Salon.com. He's written extensively about WikiLeaks. In Philadelphia, we're joined by Bill Roggio, the editor of longwarjournal.org. He's a former soldier in the US Army. He spent time in Iraq. And Stephen Livingston is a professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University, joining us from Bonn in Germany. Gentlemen, all of you, welcome to the show. Good to have you here with us. Glenn Greenwald, if I could start with you first of all. There has been some debate in the media, hasn't there, about whether or not this is indeed a selectively edited version of events. Tell us how you see it.
There was really no debate at all. There was some falsehoods disseminated primarily by the New York Times, which suggested that the video released by WikiLeaks had been selectively edited, when in fact the full unedited 38-minute video was released at exactly the same time as the shorter 18-minute video that WikiLeaks did edit to narrate what had happened. And so everyone can see the full unedited video as well as the edited video. Mr. Raggio in the Weekly Standard actually originally said, based on that New York Times article, that WikiLeaks should have released the full video, and to his credit, acknowledged that they in fact did. The New York Times wasn't quite as forthcoming, but I don't think there is any controversy any longer about the accuracy of the video or the fact that the full unedited video was available from the start.
Okay, Bill Roger, as Glenn was just describing there, you initially wrote how dismayed you were that 21 minutes had been cut out. I think you went back on that. What's your analysis now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I think it is curious that they did release a 17-minute version of that. You know, when WikiLeaks release other classified documents, they don't release partial parts. But the reality is they did release both. I think it's a little bit misleading. If you watch the full video, this part is not part of the 17-minute video, you'll see that that van that is shot up is actually driving around the streets during this firefight that the Apache helicopters are coming in. So you would be led to believe, if you only watch that 17-minute video, that this van just kind of came in out of nowhere to pick up some wounded fighters on the street, when in the reality is that this was the only vehicle moving on the street. And those people are the only people that can be seen within blocks of this area during the morning of Baghdad. So it's very clear that there is activity going on in the area. And, you know, a little bit misleading. You know, you watch that 17 minutes, there's a lot of editorializing going on in there, but that's fine. WikiLeaks released the full 38 as well. So to their credit, I will give them credit for that.
Okay, Stephen Livingston, you know, obviously this guy who was killed, one of the guys who was killed, was carrying a camera, was a journalist. The bottom line is, though, it is a dangerous situation carrying a camera in a wartime, in a theatre of war, if you like, on the streets of Baghdad, where there are ongoing battles, especially at that period in 2007 when it was incredibly dangerous on the streets. You know, it's a dangerous game.
Well, it is dangerous, whether you're carrying a camera or not. I suppose one has to conclude that the camera with the telephoto lens on it of some proportion looked like an RPG. He's peeking around the corner, and in the view of the pilot, of the gunner, it looked like a threat, and so the threat was taken out. But this really, I mean, what is so interesting to me about this is how the development of technology has led to difficulties in even maintaining informational security. We're living in a world where if it happens, it's more likely to be covered. And I think that the larger story here about WikiLeaks is that story.
Absolutely. And Bill Roger, that's the point, isn't it? New technology brings new checks and balances, and here throws a light on the way soldiers performed in the heat of battle, and they were pretty gung-ho, it was revealed by this video.
Yeah, absolutely. WikiLeaks, it's very interesting how this video comes to light. There's a lot of controversy out there on WikiLeaks. Are they leaking too much classified information? You know, I stand in the middle of this as a reporter, and I've embedded with U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, I could say that a lot of times a lot of information is overclassified. I do know that some of the information that shows up on WikiLeaks can harm operational security. When the enemy has a copy of what the rules of engagement are, for instance, the enemy could use that to their advantage. So there's, you know, but then again, you know, it's interesting to actually know what are the rules of engagement. And we know what the rules of engagement with this helicopter, this Apache strike, were, because WikiLeaks also leaked the rules of engagement. And when you read the rules of engagement, when you watch the video, and there also was an investigation by the military into this, you can see that this really wasn't a war crime or a violation of the laws of war. So, you know, WikiLeaks is really showing us what they're showing us is that war is a nasty business.
Isn't the issue on this particular case what the pilots were saying to each other and how lightly they seem to take the whole business of killing people?
Exactly. I mean, that is an issue if that's something that concerns you. But war is as said, this is a reality of war, and war is an ugly business. And you have people in the military that are, you know, assigned to kill people, and it's not an easy task, and it's something, you know, that you get a lot of dark humor that goes along with it.
Glenn Greenwald, wartime, a very difficult period to play by any rules, especially when the enemy knows what your rules are and isn't playing by them.
Well, I think, the real point here is, actually, I agree with what Bill Roggio just said, which is that war is an extremely ugly business. And I think that's the real value of what we see on this videotape. I mean, the first incident where they mistook a camera for an RPG, one can suggest that there's ambiguity there, that one can understand that in those conditions, soldiers could do that. I think any morally decent person would be repulsed by the second incident, where they shot at what was clearly an unarmed person rescuing an unarmed wounded man.
Okay, we seem to
near death, but
no, do carry on. We lost your audio for a second there, but you're back in contact.
Right, and so I think what the real value of this is that this is what happens in war, in all wars, all the time. This is what war is. And I think there's a real value in having Americans who typically don't see what our government is doing thousands of miles away in these countries, who are subjected to propaganda only about how we're spreading democracy and liberating people. I think there's a real value in seeing the inhumanity and brutality of what that really means and being forced to confront it in a way that Americans typically don't. And I think that's the real value of what WikiLeaks does, is it sheds light on things that our media and that our Congress, which is charged with oversight, fails to shed light upon and triggers real important debates and discussions about what we're really doing in the world.
Okay, well, gentlemen, this is just the latest in a long string of sensitive information that WikiLeaks has made public. Let's just take a quick look at some of their activity in recent times. In November 2007, WikiLeaks released a U.S. Army protocol at Guantanamo Bay detention camp, which included classified information on detainees. The following year, contents of Sarah Palin's personal email account were published on the website. In November 2008, names and addresses of members of the far-right British National Party were released to the public. And early in 2009, WikiLeaks released over 600 international United Nations reports. 60 of those were confidential. In November 2009, they made public pager messages sent on 9/11, which included messages between the Pentagon and New York's police department. Stephen Livingston, accountability is the name of the game here, isn't it? And new technology, as you were saying, has to help that, be it through leaked military footage on the web or mobile phone footage of, a murder in Iran.
Indeed, we're in an environment now where there is something approaching 5 billion mobile phones in existence around the world. The exact figure is sometimes hard to get an exact count on, but the point is in just about every continent in the world, there are devices that have the ability to record and monitor events. We've seen this in various locations, certainly as a matter of fact in Iraq. Viewers may recall that Saddam Hussein's hanging was taped using cellular telephony. So with that, with WikiLeaks, Wikipedia, other kinds of technologies, it's becoming more and more difficult to seal off an environment and keep information from leaking out of it.
So Stephen, where does a source such as WikiLeaks fit into the new media landscape, if you like?
Over the years, we've heard similar kinds of arguments. Almost 20 years ago now, we used to hear arguments about how CNN and global real-time media that was evolving at that point in time might constitute a threat to operational security or might have other kinds of debilitating effects on conduct of foreign policy. And over time, it seems like with each new technology, those kinds of arguments or similar arguments are brought out and we hear them again. And then we move and we learn to adopt in that environment and conduct policy as always. The key here, though, is that if you are operating in Iraq or Afghanistan, both places I've been to several times in the last 14 months, it's a different kind of war. It's a war about winning hearts and minds, about not conducting yourself in a way that's going to offend the sensibilities not only of the Afghanis or the Iraqis, but the Americans and Europeans and others. So this kind of technological environment puts a lot of pressure on the military, on individual soldiers who are operating in a very, very difficult environment to make split-second decisions and be sure that if they are about to shoot at someone or something, that they have a clear sense of who the target is. Unfortunately, that is pretty apparently not the case with regards to the helicopter shooting at the journalist and others.
Yeah, Bill Roggio, not much evidence of winning hearts and minds in that footage, is there?
Well, I actually disagree. I mean, what you had, you're only, first of all, this video is only showing you one portion of the battle that was ongoing at the time. You had troops on the ground that were a little over a block away. If you listen to that tape, or watch that tape, you'll hear the ground element saying, hey, I see a guy pointing an RPG at us from around the corner. And then the Apache pilot says, yes, it does look like he has an RPG pointed at us. So you have, and this group was ambushed by fighters. Why were there, there were armed men within this group that was on the ground. The Reuters photographers were not wearing body armor. They were not wearing anything that had identified them as being journalists. So, it's not as clear cut that this was like, a clear case of misidentification by the pilots. They recovered an RPG at the scene. They recovered weapons at the scene of the attack. So, I have to say in this case, I'm probably in the minority here, but this is not a clear-cut case that they misidentified targets and fired on them.
Glenn Greenwald?
Well, I think all that it takes is a little bit of empathy to see why, regardless of your opinion about what these soldiers did, why this is so extraordinarily counterproductive. I mean, just imagine if there was a foreign army that invaded the United States, and after shooting at a whole variety of civilians and killing them, including some of our journalists, then other Americans arrived on the scene to take some of the wounded to hospitals, and then they, despite being unarmed, were then shot at and killed as well, while their children were severely wounded sitting in the car. Americans from top to bottom would be extremely outraged to the point of wanting to do serious violence against the country that was responsible. And so whatever opinions we might have about rules of engagement and whether these soldiers are acting correctly, the reality is that we're leaving a trail of extreme anti-American sentiment and hatred, exactly what fuels the terrorism that we're supposedly trying to combat through this behavior. And that's true in Iraq, and it's true in Afghanistan, where a similar incident was just revealed, where the U.S. Army slaughtered 5 civilians, including 3 women, 2 of whom were pregnant, lied about it, and claimed that they were found bound and gagged, only for them to have to admit that they were telling falsehoods when an intrepid investigative journalist uncovered the facts. General McChrystal recently just said that we're killing an amazing number of innocent people by shooting them at checkpoints. So these kind of incidents over and over and over again are undermining exactly what we claim our objectives are, and we're exacerbating terrorism by creating the exact anti-American sentiment that fuels it.
It's certainly stirring up issues in the corridors of power, isn't it? There's a suggestion that WikiLeaks is being targeted by the US government and others around the world. Do you think that's the case, Mr. Livingston?
No, I wouldn't suspect they are, though if one thinks back, there's been suggestions that Al Jazeera, for instance, was targeted in the opening days of the war in Baghdad, as well as in Kabul and Afghanistan before that. But my hunch is that's probably not the case. I want to step back, though, for a minute and really just reiterate the point that one of our guests here disagreed with. I'm simply saying that the information environment today, because of the various kinds of technologies, just not one technology. We're not just talking about one website here, but an entire global phenomenon of various ways of seeing what happens, that it does indeed put additional pressure on U.S. military forces. It does make their job more difficult to conduct themselves in a way that, first of all, force protection is recognized, secondly, that the mission is accomplished, but thirdly, that you don't end up killing people innocently, because that's going to be incredibly counterproductive to the overall strategic goals of the operation. So there isn't anything to disagree with, I think, in that. It's simply to say that the U.S. military and other militaries are finding themselves operating in a very different information environment that makes these kinds of things all that much more likely.
Yeah, Bill, Roger, it's a very different environment, and everybody's got to learn how to deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree 100% with what Mr. Livingston said. I was trying to make a more specific point about this particular instance. And I absolutely agree. The environment that the military has to operate under is just the pressures that they face. I mean, they have to watch everything they say. Look at what they're being said, or how what they're being said on this videotape is being dissected. The technology that is out there, everybody, as he said, everybody has a cell phone. Everyone has a camera on that phone. Everyone can shoot video on that phone. You have instances where sometimes soldiers have blogs and they put up things that that can be deemed offensive I've even seen instances where soldiers put things up that, that show that they've done things wrong. So it's an extremely complex situation. And, the ugly reality of war is that to have a zero innocents killed threshold, it's just not achievable. You have to do the absolute best. I think the U.S. military does this. I've gone out with the U.S. military multiple times. I spent months and months with the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I've seen them act with nothing but kindness to take care of Iraqi civilians, take care of Iraqi soldiers that they've been mentoring. There are going to be instances where soldiers act outside of the bounds of war, just as policemen do, just as anyone violates any type of conduct. Soldiers are not, they're not saints.
Okay.
There's going to be bad apples within the bunch.
All right, I just want to bring in Stephen Livingstone. We're coming towards the end of the program. Just one point here. Do those who say that WikiLeaks and its like, it endangers military personnel in the theatre of battle, are they right, do you think?
They're right to the degree to which any source of information gives away sensitive operational security information that can assist the enemy in killing American soldiers or achieving other goals. The thing is that I have yet to see convincing evidence from anyone, including the Pentagon, that WikiLeaks has crossed that threshold and has provided operationally sensitive information that can be used against American forces. I haven't seen that. Instead, what I've most often seen is WikiLeaks releasing information that is embarrassing to the United States military and certainly debilitating to the Hearts and Minds campaign, if that's what you want to call it, certainly the debilitating to any effort that we are making to say that we are conducting ourselves in a way that respects the sanctity of life of innocence. That's the damage that's being done. One could argue that that latter point leads to a sense of anger, a sense of animosity on the part of Iraqis who otherwise wouldn't feel it and who will take up arms and join al-Qaeda or join some resistance.
Okay.
That's the kind of concern that we have.
So, Glenn Greenwald, in the end, I guess you've got to ask the question, are revelations like this likely to make any difference to the way war operations are conducted, to the rules of engagement?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure that it will. I mean, you've seen instances like the Abu Ghraib revelations where those abuses temporarily changed the way that Americans think about torture, and yet it didn't really have much of an effect on how Americans interrogated detainees. We continued to use the torture regime that led directly to those abuses. And here you have an instance where people are shocked and horrified by what they're seeing on the video, and yet the U.S. military says that these pilots did nothing wrong, that they aren't bad apples, they weren't rogue sadists, they were conforming to what U.S. military policy called for, they did nothing wrong, and therefore it's very difficult to see any changes taking place, and that really underscores the enormous dilemma of what the U.S. is doing in both Afghanistan and Iraq. It's simply not possible to fight wars and occupy countries without engaging in behavior like this. It's inevitable, and yet the more behavior we engage in like this, the more counterproductive the results are to what we claim we're trying to achieve. And certainly the solution isn't to suppress it or conceal it, the way the Obama administration has tried to do in the military. The more light shined on it, the better, so that Americans can have an informed debate about what we ought to be doing in the world.
Okay, interesting discussion, gentlemen, but we've run out of time. Glenn Greenwald, Bill Roggio, and Stephen Livingstone, thanks for your contributions today. And thanks for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. If you don't know, Inside Story at aljazeera.net is our email address. Drop us a line about what you've seen and what you've heard. From me, Nick Clark, it's goodbye for now.